Do you ever struggle with bad self-talk? You know, that kind of, everybody looks up. No, never, never, never. That narrative, right? That narrative in your head that says things to you that no one else would ever say to you, hopefully. Right? But it's that kind of, I'm so stupid, I'm so this, I'm so that. I always do this. And normally we keep it inside our heads, but sometimes it leaks out. Right? Sometimes we kind of say it out loud, and we hope no one heard when we did that. Because we learned long ago that we keep those feelings to ourselves. That we have learned to pretend like we're okay. Different people do it in different ways. Sometimes we try to cover it up by trying to act happy, even when we're not happy. Sometimes, and I see this more in guys, I think, but we try to kind of puff up and show how tough we are and how blustery we are and how much I'm okay. Of course, if you have to tell me you're okay that much, maybe you're not okay. Because the reality is that those sort of things are just a camouflage. It's a camouflage we've learned to put on because we just don't want people to know. Because we feel like we're the only one. When we're in it, we feel like we're the only one experiencing it. And one of the challenges with that camouflage of that kind of pushing those feelings down or keeping them locked up inside of us is that doing that doesn't actually make us feel any better. It just makes it look like we feel better. And what do you really want? You just want to feel better. And then it kind of gets worse because as you look around, everyone else seems good. Right? It seems like everyone else is happier than you are, is more together than you are, is more in control of their life than you are. And social media is engineered to prove that to you, that everyone's life is better than yours. Their cat is better than my cat, which is a lie, by the way. But the reality is that all of that makes us feel worse. And a question starts to fill our mind. What's wrong with me? Why is this always going on? Why is everyone else okay? Why is everyone so happy? And I'm so broken. I feel so alone. And of course, the challenge is that even though you feel that you're alone, you are not alone. We all feel that way from time to time. Sometimes we feel that way a lot of the time. Years ago in my life, I felt like this almost all the time. But by God's grace, I don't experience that so much anymore. And the thing that makes it so much worse is that I can tell you here that you are not alone. And that's not going to make you feel any less alone. Because as you look around, why do you feel so alone? Because nobody else looks like they're going through it. But the thing to remember is, you're not the only one who's figured out how to camouflage. We've all figured out how to camouflage. We've all figured out how to, in a civil society, look like we're okay. And there are times we need to not be okay. And this struggle is universal. And I think it's a struggle that we all share, some of us harder than others, but it's something we all share. But I do believe it's something we can begin to break free of. It doesn't happen quickly. It certainly doesn't happen instantly, but it can happen. In my life, it's happened. I'm not saying I'm perfect. I'm not saying it never happens, but nowhere near as much as it used to. And what I have found is that it comes down to applying a few core principles. A few core principles that, if applied consistently, can begin to help us break out from it. So, of course, where do we start? What's a good place to start? Well, I think that a really good place to start is to think of a child. If a child you care about, if you heard them talking to themselves that way, what would you want to do? Well, you'd want to remind them of how important they are, right? And I think that whatever works on a child is probably a good place for us to start. And luckily, today, KidMin started. And since my wife teaches KidMin, I know what's going on down there. At least I think I know. And what's interesting is that this week, the foundation of the message downstairs is, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, it's a verse you've probably heard more times than you can count. And, the wonderfully part's pretty easy, but the fearfully part, like, what, am I fearfully made? I mean, I guess depending on how I act, I could be. But why are we fearfully and wonderfully made? Well, because it's an English translation from Hebrew. And it's always important to remember that no matter how good a translation is, it's never perfect. It never fully captures the original language. And the Hebrew word that's translated there as fearfully does sometimes mean fear, but it also means worthy of honor, worthy of respect, and worthy of awe. And even wonderfully, the word that's translated as wonderfully can also mean marvelous and miraculous and displaying awesome power. And so what this verse is to remind us of is that you are something worthy of honor, respect, and awe. You display awesome power, and you are a miracle. You are a miraculous creation. Now, when you walk up to the mirror and you look at yourself, is that what you see? Is that the first thought that pops into your head? Because that's what God sees. God sees someone who is miraculous and important and awesome. And in fact, what we're doing downstairs with the kids today is that we actually have a number of activities planned. I say we like I had anything to do with it, by the way. But we have a number of activities planned. And one of the things that the kids are getting to take home is this placemat, which I'm sure you can't see, but I have a large picture of it here. Basically, it's a whole bunch of activities based around that verse, but the blue circle in the corner is my favorite. The kids are encouraged to say, who made you wonderful? God made me wonderful. And I don't think it would hurt for any of us to do that. Who made you wonderful? God made me wonderful. Now, I know this is New England and people don't like to talk out loud, but I'm going to try anyway. I'm going to ask the question, who made you wonderful? God made me wonderful. Say it like you actually believe it this time. Right? Who made you wonderful? God made me wonderful, and you are wonderful, and you are important, and you are miraculous, and you are awesome, and you are worthy of honor and awe. But we don't feel like it sometimes. But we want to go through a process of learning to see ourselves more like God sees us. So what I wanted to do today was actually walk through a narrative that I think does a really good job of kind of illustrating these principles that can take us from a place in our lives where that dark, heavy self-narrative that weighs us down can start to be broken away from and start to see ourselves more the way God sees us. And the narrative I wanted to look at is the narrative of Gideon. Now, Gideon is a person who lived about 3,000 years ago, and he lived in really challenging times. But one of the things we find is that when we meet Gideon, he has a really bad self-image. Now, some of that self-image comes from his circumstances, but some of that self-image appears to kind of originate within him. But part of what makes Gideon, to me, so relatable is that not only does he have that struggle with his own view of himself, but he also struggles understanding God. That he looks around at the broken world that he lives in, and he wonders, with so many things so bad, where is God? Why doesn't God fix it? So through his own struggle with himself, he struggles with his relationship with God. Now, Gideon lives in the Old Testament period known as the period of the Judges. Now, the Judges are this relatively narrow period in the Old Testament history, and they fall in a really important place. That they're kind of after the big leaders like Moses and Joshua, but they're before the kings, King David, King Solomon. It's this narrow period in there, which is the Judges. And if you look at the book of Judges, it actually says that there was no leader. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So it's basically everybody's just kind of running their own life. But once in a while, you need someone who at least does a leader in certain, or does leader type things in certain instances. And those are the judges. The judges are not people who sit in the court and rule whether something is right or wrong. In this context, the judges are these kind of charismatic leaders that rise up, not to run the government, but largely as a defender of their people. And as we'll see, Gideon eventually rises up to become one of these judges. Now, what's happening in Gideon's life is that his homeland is being overrun by these surrounding nations. And these nations are basically acting like marauders, so that they actually come in, they steal the food from the people in Gideon's homeland, they actually burn the crops, they kill the livestock, they still steal the livestock. And as a result, Gideon and his people are starving. They are barely scratching out a life. Actually, I wouldn't even call it a life. They're barely scratching out an existence to survive. And to show you kind of how heavy things are and how weighed down Gideon is, when we meet Gideon, he's actually hiding at the bottom of a wine press. Now that may sound enticing to some of you, but in the ancient world, what a wine press was is they would go to an area that was a large stone area, and they would chip away at the stone, creating a very large round hole. And the idea was, as you crush the grapes, the juice would gather into this hole. So what that really means is that Gideon is hiding at the bottom of a hole. And what he's doing is he's got some stalks of wheat, and he's kind of beating them against a rock, trying to get a little bit of food off that. So as we meet him, he is cowering at the bottom of a hole, trying to scrape out some wheat to survive. And he's hiding there for fear that somebody from one of these other nations would see him and even steal those scraps from him. And so as he's in this very, I'll say, a difficult position, he receives an unexpected visitor. It says, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Now, do you think in that moment, Gideon feels like a mighty warrior? Cowering in the bottom of the hole, trying to scrape out of existence? But notice that God does see Gideon as a mighty warrior. In fact, as we'll see, God sees Gideon as someone who's capable of great things. And that's kind of, I think, the first lesson we can take from Gideon. So often our view of ourselves is circumstantial. When our circumstances are pretty good, we feel a bit better about ourselves. But when our circumstances are heavy and bad, we feel really bad about ourselves. But that doesn't apply to God. God's view of us is constant. God knows what's inside of you. And I say this often, but I don't think I can say it often enough. God loves you as you are. God is not looking for some future version of you that will be better and waiting for that to come to love you. God loves you as you are. And even when we doubt ourselves, God doesn't. God is in it with you. God believes in you. And God has important plans for your life if you will step into that process with him. But now for Gideon, he's not having it. He hears the mighty warrior. In fact, I'm not even sure he even hears the phrase mighty warrior. He's certainly not interested in that phrase. He heard something else that kind of set him off. He heard, "The Lord is with you." And for Gideon, cowering at this hole, trying to get a little bit of food, he's like, "You got to be kidding." Because Gideon goes on, "Pardon me, my Lord, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." And Midians are one of the countries that are attacking them. So basically, again, Gideon skips right past the mighty warrior and basically says to God, "I have a question. If you're a good God, why is there so much bad around? Because isn't that inconsistent with a good God?" And I think it's a very common question to ask. In fact, in people that I have dealt with who do not believe in God or lost their faith in God, this is one of the most often cited reasons. That I saw all the brokenness in the world. I saw all the badness in the world. And I just can't believe that God exists, or if he exists, he certainly doesn't care. It's a common attitude. And I think it's a reasonable attitude. And that's where Gideon's at. Because basically Gideon's like, well, if you're such a good God, there's all this bad, why don't you do something? And God responds. The Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? So what was the answer? God, why don't you do something? God said, I did. I created you. And you were fearfully and wonderfully made. But you got to decide to show up. You got to decide to be part of the battle. You got to realize that you were created with gifts and abilities and choose to develop those. And then use them. So if you're a talented speaker, you become a better speaker. If you're a talented manager, become a better manager. If you're a talented engineer or a carpenter or anything else, become better at it. Develop it. In Gideon's case, God's like, you're capable of helping to defend this. Step into it. Now, do you think that was the answer Gideon was looking for? Well, no, yes. No, thank you. Participation, please. Participation, please. Would it be the answer that you wanted? Let's put it that way. Do you want that answer? Of course not. But that is the answer. Right? That is the answer. To show up. To develop what you have and show up. You know, and that's in every aspect of our lives, whether it's our professions, whether it's our families, whether it's social things that we try to be a part of. Develop what you've been given and show up. But again, that wasn't the answer Gideon was looking for. So as Gideon hears that, right, as he hears, am I not sending you? Gideon suddenly gets a little bit less bold. Pardon me, my Lord, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family. In other words, wait a minute, I'm nobody from nowhere. I'm the least of the least. And I think that was an honest response. I don't think that was a cop-out from Gideon. I think that really is how he saw himself, that how can I possibly be part of this solution? He doesn't see how there's any way he can make a difference. But also in this, Gideon gives us a really important lesson. Gideon is clearly filled with doubt in this moment. He's filled with doubt in himself. He was clearly filled with doubt in God. But he does something that's so important. He stays engaged with God. He doesn't stop praying. He doesn't stop that connection. That he doesn't just turn his back and walk away from it all. And I think that's the thing that can be so tempting, that when we are disappointed with ourselves, we are disappointed with life, when we are disappointed in God, and if we're honest, many of us get disappointed with God sometimes. It can be so easy to say, I'm just not talking to him anymore. I'm just not doing this anymore. But as you've heard me refer to before, imagine you're in a marriage and that happens. Right? You're better off arguing than not talking to each other. Right? You're better off struggling with it than not talking to each other. Because once you stop talking, it's over. And Gideon stays in it, and he keeps talking to God. And what we find as we travel along with Gideon, that it's in that struggle with God, and in his struggle to believe what God is telling him, he starts to get a greater sense of his purpose. He starts to realize he actually has a purpose. Also, his faith in God grows. And so this whole belief system starts to kind of develop inside of Gideon. He begins to believe in God more, begins to believe in himself more, believes he has a purpose. And the thing that's so important here is that he recognizes that God is not calling him to do this so that Gideon can prove to God that Gideon's good enough. He also comes to understand that God already considers him good enough, that he is intrinsically valuable. As you are intrinsically valuable, You are valuable to God because you are you. And what Gideon begins to understand is that he's not being called to a purpose to prove that he's valuable. The proper attitude is the reverse of that. Because you are valuable, stand in the strength of being loved unconditionally and step boldly into purpose to do the things that you can do. And so for each of us, I think that that is the kind of foundational steps in beginning to break free of our self-doubt. Basically, keep praying. Struggle it out with God. Talk with God. Tell him when you're upset. Tell him when you don't get it. Tell him when you're looking for a different answer than the one you got. But then also, trust that you are created with a purpose. Even if you don't know what it is yet. Even if you don't know what your purpose is yet, you have abilities. Right? No matter what stage of life you're in, right? You have gifts and abilities. Get better at those. Again, develop what you have. But at the same time, stand confidently that you're not doing this to try to get God to love you, you're not even trying to do this to be good enough, because you're already good enough. Stand in that confidence as you go forward with it. And for Gideon, what we see is as time goes on, and he stands in that process of, prayer. I mean, it talks about him talking to God, but what is prayer? It's talking to God. He stays in that process, and he does all these things. And for him, his larger purpose starts to become more clear. And if you read through the narrative, you'll see he has kind of incremental things going on in his life until he finally reaches this kind of larger moment. And for Gideon, something happens that I think happens for many of us. That if we engage in this process, when you get to your big moment, you're not as excited as you were before because it starts to be scary. And for Gideon, he is called to do something scary. Basically, Gideon discovers that those nations that have been individually attacking him over time are getting together. And they're all coming together in one camp. And they're about to all attack at once. And there's no one to lead the defense of Gideon's homeland. That's why they were such easy picking, because they weren't standing together, they were all standing apart. So Gideon knows something needs to be done. But he doesn't like the fact that he feels that God is calling him to be the one to lead everyone else, because it's just too scary. Just too scary. So what Gideon starts to do is he starts to ask for clarity. And it's actually a fairly large section where he battles through this idea of clarity with God. And he kind of starts negotiating with God, which I don't really consider to be a good practice. But in the sense, though, it really demonstrates something really important. That he kind of goes to God and is like, well, I think you want me to do this, but I don't think I want to, or that can't be true, so would you do this? And in the narrative, God does. And then he comes back to God again later. Yeah, I know you kind of confirmed what I was thinking before, but could you just do it one more time so that I'm sure? And again, although I don't really like this idea of kind of negotiating with God, it demonstrates something that's really important. That it's okay to go to God. I don't like the answer. And I need better clarity. And I'm not sure I'm supposed to do this. Help me to understand what I'm supposed to do. Basically, it demonstrates that it is okay to wrestle out what you're feeling with God, to try to find the other side. And the other thing it demonstrates is that how important it was that Gideon remained engaged with prayer when things were simpler. Because remember that when Gideon first has this encounter at the beginning of the narrative, he's kind of questioning God, like, is God even here? But at this point, God is no longer a far-off idea to him. At this point, for Gideon, God is real. God is personal. And Gideon is comfortable questioning what's going on. And you can't step into a heavy situation and be there. Right? If you wait until things are super heavy to kind of say, I'm going to start praying, it's not that God's not there, but it's that we have difficulty engaging in that process. Prayer, like anything else, is something that you get more comfortable with over time and more capable at over time. And when I say capable, not like you're a good prayer, that's not what I mean, right? But the ability to be honest with God and to struggle with God and say that I want something different than what I think you're asking me to do. but also be willing to be in it and recognize that I trust God enough to believe that even if it's not what I want to do, I'm going to trust it's the path that's the right path for me. And so for Gideon, although he is very afraid, he does step up to lead, and he is willing to be bold. And I think that's something that we all want to hang on to, that God calls us to be bold sometimes, to step out beyond what we believe we can do on our own, and trust that he will be in that process with us. So Gideon steps up, and he puts out a call. And he calls all the men in his clan to come together, to come and defend against the attackers. And it turns out it is incredibly successful. Thousands upon thousands of men from his clan show up to help defend against these invaders. But then the narrative takes kind of almost uncomfortable turn. As Gideon stands there looking at the thousands of men who have shown up to defend their land, Gideon feels God lead him to say, "You've got too many people here. Trust me." God is saying, "Trust me, I am in this with you. And if I have called you to do something, I will lead you through it. And I want you to trust me that there are too many people here. You will do better without all these people." Now, that seems kind of reckless, right? Why would you not want every person there that could be there? But Gideon complies. And Gideon begins a process of reducing the number of men that are there. And he goes from literally tens of thousands of men to start to just a few hundred. But something really important happened in that process. Although that original group was really large, and being part of a big group can give you comfort at first, what we find throughout that process is that large group were not the people that were going to help Gideon to be successful. Because we discovered that most of them were so afraid that they would turn and run at the first chance they got. So literally in the middle of battle, 90% of his soldiers would have turned and run. And what would that have done to the other 10% if that happens? And then he learned others were not alert and they weren't watchful. And they were going to be a liability in battle. And so what we find is that Gideon has a far greater chance of success with this small group than he has with the much larger group. And I think that's another key thing we want to hold on to when we're trying to break free from self-doubt. That on the surface, it may seem more comfortable to be part of a really large group, to be what kind of everybody else is doing. But no matter how old we are, whether we're younger or older, that group may at first give us comfort, but over time, what's going to start to happen? You're going to start trying to fit into the group more. You're going to start trying to be more like what the group is doing. What ends up happening is that we get less willing to be ourselves and less willing to pursue our individual purpose. We become less willing to be who we actually are. So, in order to be emotionally healthy, because if you think about it, the situation I just described with the large group actually would feed into that negative narrative, that if you're not comfortable in who you are, if you don't comfortable believing that the people around you accept you as you are, that narrative is going to get worse and worse. So a key to being emotionally healthy and crushing that narrative that begins to crush you is to be part of a smaller group who supports you, with people that you support, to be with people you trust, people you can talk with openly, who can talk openly and honestly to you. We need people in our lives who are invested in our success, we are invested in their success, and they accept us as we are. That smaller group, that tighter group who accepts you as you are, and that you accept as they are, I think is a fundamental element in being successful. And that's exactly what Gideon finds. That Gideon, together with following God's lead, this small group of supporters, then his own abilities that he has spent time now developing, stepping into his purpose, they sneak into the camp of the attackers, and they're able to have them driven out. And it's following that event that Gideon the guy who started out hiding in a hole, rises up to become one of the judges. Now, from an outsider looking in, it would seem like it was victory in battle that led to Gideon rising up and being better at who he is and better at what he does and being a judge. But that was just a moment it became visible. That entire time between that first encounter with God, the changes he made along the way, the processes and principles that he followed that ultimately led to his success, every one of those were part of what led Gideon to be free from the weight of the voice in his own head, to be free from the weight that held him down, to be free from the fact that he felt like he had no value or no purpose, or at least did not see himself as valuable as he is. And those principles that work in Gideon's life work in our lives. I am certain of it. I am certain of it. And it really comes down, I think, to four things: prayer, purpose, prepare, and people. Right? They're the four things. Those are the four pieces that I think really are key to breaking through that thing that holds us down. Right? The first one, prayer, right? Stay in connection with God. Right? And I'm not talking about prayer in the sense of looking for some magic prayer that's going to, if I say the right set of words, it's going to turn everything around. What I'm saying is being open and honest in connection with God. Even when you doubt, especially when you doubt, stay connected in prayer. Purpose, trust that you have one. And even if you're at a later phase in life where you've kind of finished your career, you still have a purpose. There are things that you do that you're uniquely qualified to do, things you can do now that you could not have done before, didn't have the time to do before. We all have a purpose. I truly believe if you're still breathing, you got a purpose. And then prepare. You have gifts and abilities. And if we're good at something, we can be tempted to ride on the fact that we're good at it. But what I would say is if you're good at something, get better at it. Be the best at the thing that you're good at. Don't settle for being good enough, because I think some opportunities only present themselves when we prepare ourselves to be the absolute best of the abilities that we have. And then finally, people, right? Don't try to go it alone. Right? This is a lifelong battle for me. Right? I always feel more comfortable, kind of me and my wife. That's kind of how I've generally looked at life. And, it worked to a point, but it also limits you. Limits me, anyway. Right? That willingness to engage with people around you that you trust, to have people that you can openly speak with, and people who can speak truth to you, and maybe kind of tell you when you're getting off the rails a little bit, but at the same time support you and believe in you and that you believe in. Those four principles, if you follow those as a regular part of your day and your life, you'll do great things. I am certain of it. And keep in mind, great things might mean affecting one life, right? It may mean doing something professionally well. It may mean, caring for our church and the things that we do here. Because, my friends, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And I know that much of the time we don't feel like it. But just because we don't feel like it doesn't make it not true. The key is to engage in these practices, stay connected with God, develop who you are, and be bold and choose to make a difference in something. And when we do that, it makes a difference in us. And when we do that, that's when we start to look around and go, oh, God did do something about it. He empowered me to fix one tiny piece of it. If enough of us fix one tiny piece of it, you get a lot more pieces coming together, and we make a really big difference together.